what specifically would the Prove It Act change?
Well, when you go back to 1980, there was a bill called the Regulatory Flexibility Act. And what it did was it actually required the federal government to analyze whether or not there was a significant economic impact on small businesses for new regulations that came into place. And if it did, then the government was supposed to find a flexibility for small businesses. But the problem was there was no accountability mechanism. So we know from studies by the Small Business Administration that about 75% of the time, the federal government does not do that analysis at all that it's required to do under that 1980 Act, or it underestimates the economic impact on small businesses. So the Prove It Act comes back along and says, we want to give small businesses a measure of accountability for the federal government when they do not comply with that 1980 law, give them some recourse to come back and make them follow that analysis and make them determine whether or not there's a significant impact economically on small businesses or not. In fact, what it does is, in reality, it slows down the federal government from growing the regulatory burden on small businesses.
We'll go a little bit further into this interview about the impact on small businesses, but I want to ask you specifically about your inspiration. I'm curious, was there like a small business here in the first district that voiced concerns that led you to put this act forward? I'm curious about the inspiration.
Well, we could probably list 1,000 small businesses in East Texas that we've talked to that along the way, the number one thing that they talk about is the regulatory burden from Washington, D.C., that they need Washington, D.C. out of their life. They need the free market to determine, and their hard work and their decisions to determine their future, not Washington, D.C. And so, yeah, we know it was a pervasive issue. My thanks to Brad Finstead for leading this effort. And frankly, Representative Caraveo, this is a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation, which is unique in Congress, in particular when you're talking about a pro-business and pro-economic growth piece of legislation, which this absolutely is.
Now, in a statement, you said the act, quote, creates a way for small businesses to raise concerns when federal regulators do not consider both the direct and indirect costs or regulations placed on them. I want to go into that. How do small businesses raise concerns, and what threshold needs to be met to sort of alleviate those costs they feel are being imposed on them?
Well, this particular statute would provide for a real easy form petition by small businesses to the office of the chief counsel within the Small Business Administration to say, hey, look, there's nothing going on here that complies with that 1980 law, and we believe that there is a significant economic impact on small businesses as a result of this rule. We'd like for you to look at it. Then the chief counsel's office effectively makes a prima facie review of that rule, and the regulatory rulemaking process determines whether or not the government did or did not comply with the 1980 Act, and whether or not there will be or appears to be a significant economic impact on small businesses. If there is a prima facie determination that, in fact, there probably is a likelihood that that happened, then the council can call for a full review, in which case then the government has to satisfy its burden to come in and say, oh, yeah, we did do the work, and here's the work. If they didn't, then they must go through that process fully for the full review. At the end of that review, then, the government, if there is determined to be a significant economic impact on the small business, they've got to go back and comply with those rules of the Regulatory Flexibility Act of 1980, find a way for small businesses to work around that new imposition of economic impact on them through this new rule. Or if they won't do that, the rule doesn't apply to small businesses and simply does not go into effect for them.
So that significant impact, is there, if this costs a business of this size, X amount of money, we're not going to do it. Like, is there a specific, requirement to reach for this to sort of take effect?
Yeah, it's really on a case-by-case basis. And there's some statutory guidance back in that 1980 statute about that. But the goal here was to give recourse and a procedure by which small businesses, without jumping through an immense amount of hurdles, could challenge the behavior of the federal government and going through the rulemaking process and say, hey, federal government, you skipped over these requirements in the 1980 Regulatory Flexibility Act, and you must now comply with it. And if you don't comply with it, the rule can't go into place. It puts the burden back on the federal government, which is where it should be, because so many small businesses today do not have full-time compliance officers. And these rules oftentimes are written for larger companies and have larger companies in mind. We see it in the banking world all the time, where you see new regulations come into place, and our financial institutions simply do not have, the smaller community banks don't have the personnel that can make sure that compliance occurs under these new rules. Well, that's what we don't want to see happen. We don't want to see there be such a burden on businesses that they can't just actually do the thing that they're intended to do, making widgets or making loans or whatever it is.
Now, just to be clear though, are you advocating for all regulations to be removed from small businesses? It doesn't sound like it.
No, and there's, this process is, again, just a slowdown for the federal government to say you must go through this process that's on the books already, and if you don't, then there's recourse for small businesses, and it makes very transparent and very transparent the information about the significant economic impact on those businesses, so that everybody gets a good understanding about how things are impacted. And the Democrats made the argument that you're talking about in your question. They came back and they said, "Oh, they were putting out all kinds of statements about, well, we're not going to have rules in place that are for health and safety issues like child restraint. We're not in cars. We wouldn't have ever been able to put in place a rule like that if this were in place." And that's not true. That's the boogeyman argument, because if it is truly a health and safety issue, then the federal government simply can just go through the process, prove the impact on small businesses. The transparency of the process brings accountability. If there is a real need for something to happen, it will happen if they follow the process.
Now, you mentioned your belief, you feel that this is a bipartisan piece of legislation, but it did pass the House largely on partisan lines. From what I remember, it was fewer than 5 Democrats who voted yes for it. So with that being said, how confident are you that this can actually pass a Democrat majority Senate as it is currently and make it to the president's desk, who ultimately could sign it or veto it? How confident are you this could become law?
Yeah, I'm not real confident it's going to happen in the 118th Congress with the existing Senate, the short time frame we have between now and the next 10 days, and then whether or not the president would sign or not sign. I don't think he would necessarily, but what it does is it sets up for the 119th Congress the ability to push this forward in the Senate, a new Senate with a new president, and get this kind of thing signed into law. And one of the things that I learned a long time ago is that I can only control those things within my purview. I certainly cannot control a democratically controlled Senate nor a Democratic president, but that shouldn't stop us in the House from passing good legislation and putting the onus on the Democrats to say why they're not going to pass it in the Senate or why the president won't sign it. Those Democrats that voted against it in the House, that's a measure of accountability for them. Their constituents need to see that. They've got small businesses in their district, every one of them, that should be pressing their offices today, trying to understand why they voted against a pro-small business bill, a pro-economic growth bill. That's nonsense to me.
Now, are there any other bills, whether it be in this session, which, as you say, is coming to an end soon, or the next session, which you've been reelected to, are there any other ones, any other laws you want to put forth reducing regulations, whether it be in small businesses or other sectors of the country? And would you be able to share some of that with us?
Yeah, lots of bills. I'm going to mention one actually that we passed earlier this session that came from Kat Kammick, and we hope to see it again. It's called the REINS Act. It actually sets some financial limitations on rules or actions by the executive branch. Again, it would be applicable both to Republicans and Democrats. It would say you cannot put certain rules in place or take certain executive action that had a budgetary impact of a greater than just really a de minimis number in the federal government. And so that would severely limit the executive's ability, both in the next administration and administrations to come, to legislate by fiat. We don't want that to happen. We know that the separation of powers between the Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 branches is critically important. That separation of powers has been diluted both by Republicans and Democrats through executive action and executive rulemaking. And we need to restore that the lawmaking function to the Article 1 branch of government, which is Congress.
Congressman, is there anything else you'd like for our audience to know on this piece of legislation, the Prove It Act?
Yeah, this is the kind of thing I think that East Texans sent me to Washington, D.C. to do for them, is to take the federal government burden away from them individually and from their businesses, so that they will have freer reign to live their lives without government intrusion, to grow their businesses more freely, to do the things that they want to do based on their decisions, based on their values and our values in East Texas, not DC values. And frankly, without interference by the federal government. That's the number one thing I hear across the board. So proud to be able to get this piece of legislation done the first term. We're going to keep pushing until we get it signed into law. This and others will come to reduce the burden of the federal government and to unleash the innovation and work of East Texans and Americans generally to get our economy back where it needs to be.